Nominees are highly distinguished and well qualified to serve in the roles to which they have been nominated and will play a major role in expanding economic growth. I encourage my colleagues to vote to advance them today so that they can get to work as soon as possible. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the Chairman said, the committee will vote on 5 nominees. 3 of them, Mr. Silk, Mr. Coniglio, Mr. Bobbitt, have track records that demonstrate their commitment to work on behalf of the American public. I'll support all 3 of their nominations today. I hope the Senate will immediately vote to confirm Mr. Coniglio and the 2 pending XM board nominees, Paul Schmodaloka and Claudia Slazak. We need a full XM board and a qualified inspector general to provide oversight and guidance as XM approves deals that create jobs in my state of Ohio and all of our states around the country. The other 2 nominees, Mr. Montgomery and Mr. Wohl, have each been performing the jobs they are nominated to fill for nearly a year. Unfortunately, over that year, HUD has betrayed its mission. We hear that word a lot around here. Has betrayed its mission to create strong, sustainable, inclusive communities and quality, affordable homes for all. Mr. Montgomery, the nominee for Deputy Secretary, has a long career in housing. I believe he understands the crucial role that HUD plays in the lives of Americans. But during Mr. Montgomery's tenure as second in charge of that department, HUD has repeatedly proposed to eliminate funding over the Community Development Block Grant and home programs. These are vital resources for local communities, particularly as they work to create affordable housing. It's also tried to eliminate the Public Housing Capital Fund, despite what some estimate to be a $70 billion with a B, backlog of unmet repair needs. HUD has proposed a rule that could mean 55,000 children will be kicked out of their homes and at risk of homelessness, and issued a housing reform proposal that would make home ownership less available and less affordable for working families. HUD has promoted a man with a history of racist and sexist writings who an inspector general found may have abused his authority to help oversee more than 150 employees and over $2 trillion in securities. And HUD has issued, and Mr. Montgomery has defended, a deeply troubling proposal that would undermine enforcement of the Fair Housing Act by making it all but impossible for victims of discrimination to seek justice using a disparate impact claim. What's especially troubling is that as acting Deputy Secretary, number 2, second in charge at HUD, Mr. Montgomery fails to acknowledge his role in any of this. Similarly, Mr. Wohl has a notable record in public service, both in enforcement work and overseeing the recovery efforts from the devastation of Superstorm Sandy. But in his current role at HUD, Mr. Wohl's office has failed to be responsive to Congress and the people whom we serve and to meet congressional deadlines to provide much-needed aid to Puerto Rico. Mr. Wohl oversees the formulation of a rule to gut protections for transgender people experiencing homelessness. In his nomination hearing and written responses, Mr. Wohl has failed to explain how HUD intends to prevent discrimination against this vulnerable population. And Mr. Wohl's office was responsible for pulling down a notice of funding for critical resources to house victims of human trafficking with no explanation to the many organizations who had already spent time and money applying for this grant. There have been even more troubling developments in the short time since Mr. Wohl testified before this committee. The Trump administration selected a new head for the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, who seems to think it's more important to stop church groups from providing food to people experiencing homelessness than it is to actually find them homes. He's rejected the evidence-based housing policy known as Housing First as a solution to homelessness. As the head of the office responsible for addressing homelessness, Mr. Wohl should be a critical voice in all discussions about our nation's coordinated homelessness response. I wrote to Mr. Wohl yesterday asking about his involvement in the administration's homelessness policies. Before the full Senate considers Mr. Wohl's nomination, we should all want to know how he intends to help communities around the country serve and house this most vulnerable population. Given Mr. Montgomery, Mr. Wohl's records over the past year, I intend to vote against their nominations today. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Brown. With that, we will now move to votes on the nominations. We will take up the nomination of Mr. Montgomery first. I now move for a roll call vote on the nomination of the Honorable Brian D. Montgomery to be the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman,
Aye.
Mr. Shelby,
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Toomey,
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Scott,
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Sass, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Rounds,
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Perdue, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Kennedy, Ms. McSally, Mr. Moran, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Brown,
No.
Mr. Reed, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Tester, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren,
No by proxy.
Mr. Schatz, Mr. Van Hollen.
Yes by proxy.
Okay. Ms. Cortez Masto. No. Mr. Jones. Aye. Ms. Smith. No. Ms. Sinema.
Yes by proxy.
Okay.
Yes by proxy. She was proxying for me. Yes.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, the votes are 20 in favor and 5 opposed. The nominee is approved.
Senator Sinema wished to be recorded as present, voting aye.
Okay.
And the roll call again?
20 in favor, 5 opposed.
The ayes have it. The nomination is hereby reported favorably to the full Senate. The Senate will next move to Mr. Wolf. I now move to a roll call vote on the nomination of Donald Wohl to be an Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman,
Aye.
Mr. Shelby,
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Toomey,
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Scott,
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Sass, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Rounds,
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Perdue, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Kennedy, Ms. McSally, Mr. Moran, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Reed, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Tester, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren,
No by proxy.
Mr. Schatz, Mr. Van Hollen,
No by proxy.
Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Jones, Ms. Smith, Ms. Sinema. Mr. Chairman, the votes are 16 in favor, 9 opposed. The nominee is approved.
The ayes have it, and the nomination is hereby reported favorably to the full Senate. We will now move on the nominations. We will now vote on the nominations of Silk, Bobbitt, and Coniglio on block. I move to favorably report on block the nominations of Mr. Silk to be an Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. John Bobbitt to be an Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and Mr. Peter Jay Coniglio to be Inspector General of the Export-Import Bank. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The nominations are hereby reported favorably to the full Senate. The executive session is, do any members wish to make a statement?
Yeah, no statement. I'd just like to be recorded a no on Bobbitt.
So ordered. Without any further statements, the executive session is now concluded, and we will move to open session for a hearing on the oversight of the Securities and Exchange Commission. And I thank all of our colleagues for being here promptly for the markup, or for the business meeting. Today we will receive testimony from the Securities and Exchange Commission Chairman Jay Clayton regarding the work and agenda of the SEC. I thank you for your willingness to appear before the committee today. Mr. Clayton, your willingness to testify is essential to our oversight of the SEC. The mission of the SEC is to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation. It plays a critical role in ensuring that our nation has capital markets that the public can have confidence and trust in. It provides information to investors so that as Americans prepare for their futures, they may not only have a wide variety of financial opportunities, but they also have the information necessary to make informed investment decisions. Chairman Clayton, you came before this committee a year ago and assured us that you would continue to take steps to ensure that the U.S. capital markets remain the deepest, most dynamic, and liquid in the world. I commend you and the SEC staff for your actions taken over the past year. Actions worth mentioning include the SEC's final rule package on regulation best interest, which strikes the appropriate balance of increasing transparency in investors' relationships while preserving access to advice relationships and investment products. The SEC also proposed modifying the accelerated filer definition to reduce the number of registrants subject to the auditor attestation requirement. I encourage the Commission to move forward quickly in a way that provides relief to all smaller reporting companies. And this summer, the SEC issued a concept release seeking public comment on ways to harmonize the private securities offering exemption. Regarding the concept release, I encourage the SEC to revise the Regulation D to allow for general solicitation and advertising by sponsors, such as angel investor groups. The SEC should consider expanding the ability for small businesses to crowdfund. The definition of an accredited investor should be expanded and modernized to account for qualifying expertise, not simply a monetary threshold. And it is important the SEC update the definition of a family office to allow family offices and their clients who meet certain thresholds to be considered accredited investors. This committee has held a number of hearings during my chairmanship discussing the need for assessing the scope and appropriateness of the proxy voting process and other aspects of corporate governance. I commend the Commission for its actions related to the proxy process. In August, the SEC issued guidance to assist investment advisors in fulfilling their responsibilities when voting proxies on behalf of clients, and clarified that proxy voting advice provided by proxy firms generally constitutes a solicitation. In November, after numerous roundtables and thoughtful efforts led by Commissioner Roisman, the SEC proposed 2 amendments to improve the accuracy and transparency of proxy voting advice and to modernize shareholder proposals. I encourage the SEC to continue moving forward with these efforts expeditiously following the comment period. This committee recently held an oversight hearing on the Consolidated Audit Trail, or CAT. I've continued to express concerns regarding the personally identifiable information that is going to be collected in this consolidated database and how it will be protected. On October 16, 2019, the CAT plan participants wrote to the SEC to request to use CAT customer ID instead of receiving and storing Social Security numbers in the CAT, and asked to store only a year of birth and firm IDs instead of full dates and birth and individual account numbers. Chairman Clayton, you have previously expressed concerns about the information to be collected and stored in CAT and stated that you believe the regulatory objectives of CAT can be achieved without the most sensitive pieces of investor information. I encourage you to quickly process the request to use alternative approaches. Finally, the SEC has made modernization a focus this year, and I look forward to hearing about your strategic hub for innovation and financial technology, and how the SEC has been engaging with initial coin offerings and other cryptocurrency-related matters. I look forward to receiving updates on these and other SEC initiatives, including your views on when we can expect final rules in these areas. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Chair Clayton. Nice to see you again. Over the past few years in this committee, we've seen the Trump administration dismantle, we get a front row view of this, many of the protections that Congress put in place after the last financial crisis, putting our financial system and hardworking families around the economy at risk. The SEC has flown under the radar, but often the agenda has been the same, taking Wall Street's side over and over instead of standing with investors saving for retirement or college or a down payment. Taken together, the SEC's latest actions are making it harder to hold corporate executives accountable to investors and hardworking Americans. While I appreciate the Enforcement Division's initiatives, including those to protect teachers and military service members from fraud and misconduct and financial advice, you've done so much damage by adopting what you call regulation best interest. Under that rule, brokerage firms can merely disclose but don't have to eliminate firm-level conflicts. It should be simple. Investment firms need to work for the people whom they serve. Americans need to have confidence that the professionals that they're trusting with their hard-earned money are working for them, not scamming them to line the firm's own pockets. You could have simply followed Congress's guidance in Dodd-Frank to create a uniform fiduciary standard for brokers and advisors, which would be the best way to give investors confidence that their interest comes first. But you didn't do that. That's not the only part of Dodd-Frank you are working to undermine. Look at the SEC's proposal to amend the whistleblower program, one of the most successful programs created under Dodd-Frank. We need brave workers to stand up to corruption and abuse when they see in their workplace financial companies scamming people or engaging in other illegal activity. The only way individual workers are ever able to stand up to powerful Wall Street firms is if we give them protection. We've already seen a chilling effect from your proposal. Each year since inception of the program, the number of tips has increased in some years by more than 10%. But after your rule proposal in 2018 introduced a cap on whistleblower awards, the number of tips declined for the first time in 2019. The proposed cap on awards raised so many alarm bells that you had to put out a statement to clarify. I know that whistleblower is a dirty word nowadays to some in this town. It always is to serial lawbreakers. I don't see how you can make significant changes to a successful program like this without understanding that the decline in tips is a result of your actions in the environment this administration has created in its talk about whistleblowers, attacking rather than protecting those who speak out against abuse of power. As the SEC continues to take fewer actions that hold the largest financial systems accountable, we must encourage whistleblowers to identify misconduct wherever it exists and to help uncover complex frauds. The SEC's recent proposed rules on proxy advisors and shareholder proposals are often clear examples of the administration taking the side of corporate interests over Americans struggling to save and invest for their future. Both proposals make it more difficult for shareholders to hold corporate executives accountable. The proposal on proxy advisors can make it harder for institutional investors to have timely access to independent research and analysis from the proxy advisory firms that they hire. The proposed rule would give corporations access to investors' research before the public retirement systems, investment fund managers, and foundations who manage Americans' money. The SEC says the changes are necessary because of errors and inaccuracies, but you've provided scant evidence of those errors. Instead, the new rules would give companies a new tool to intimidate proxy advisors and threaten their independence. The overhaul of the shareholder proposal rule would make it easier for corporate management to silence shareholders and to avoid dealing with important issues critical to investors. The amendments would could stop proposals for votes on issues such as a disclosure of corporate political spending, separating the roles of board chair and CEO, and non-discrimination policies. I'm disappointed in the directions you've taken on these rules that have for decades, through presidents of both parties and SEC chairs of both parties, allowed investors to hold management accountable, all while executives are further entrenching themselves and ignoring workers and shareholders. Protecting workers' hard-earned savings should begin with a simple concept, putting their rights first. I hope the SEC will remember that. But over the last week, last week and this week, we've had nearly all the financial regulators come before this committee. We've had the Fed, we've had the FDIC, we had the NCUA, today the SEC, all defending the same policies. They amount to a wish list for Wall Street in corporate interests, all afflicted with a collective amnesia about what happened in the last decade or so. The president promised to look after ordinary, hardworking people, but he and the people he's put in charge of these agencies betray those workers over and over and over again. And, Mr. Chair, I'd like to offer for the record this letter from the Ohio Public Employees Retirement System raising concerns about the SEC's rulemaking on proxy advisory firms.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chairman Clayton, you may make your presentation.
Thank you, Chairman Crapo, Ranking Member Brown, Senators of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today about the work of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I want to start by thanking you for your support for the Commission's mission and its people. The dedicated women and men of the Commission are our most important asset. With the resources Congress provided last year, we've been able to lift our hiring freeze and fill around 140 new positions with high-quality individuals who I believe will serve investors well. Since becoming chairman, the interests of our long-term Main Street investors have been front of my mind. With that perspective, a perspective our staff has long held, I would like to highlight just a few aspects of our work over the past year. First, modernization has been a key avenue for advancing all three aspects of our mission. In June, the Commission adopted a package of rules and interpretations designed to enhance the quality and transparency of the relationship our Main Street investors have with their broker-dealer or investment advisor. These measures bring legal duties and mandated disclosures in line with what a reasonable investor would expect, while preserving access in terms of both choice and cost to a variety of investment services and products. I am so grateful to our experienced and dedicated staff for bringing long overdue regulatory rationality and clarity to this important area. We're also working to respond to the substantial changes that have taken place in our markets, including that more capital is raised in our private markets than our public markets, and many companies are staying private until they are very large or not going public at all. We've expanded key aspects of the Jobs Act to increase the attractiveness of our public markets for companies while maintaining or enhancing investor protections. Increasing the attractiveness of our public capital markets is just one side of the coin. We're also exploring whether through fund structures or other measures we can increase the type and quality of opportunities Main Street investors have in our private markets. I believe we should strive to ensure that an individual retirement portfolio can look like a well-managed pension fund with robust investor protection that reflects the individual nature of the account. This is a challenge, but we are making progress. In many other areas, modernization efforts are making a difference for our investors and our markets. These efforts not only include rulemakings, but also the monitoring of market function and market risk. Turning to our inspections and enforcement efforts, I want to highlight our teachers and military service members initiatives, where we have focused additional enforcement and education resources. My message here is simple. If you're ripping off teachers, service members, or veterans, we want to catch you, punish you, and get them their money back. Returning funds to harmed investors continues to be a priority, and this year we returned over $1.2 billion to harmed investors. I've previously testified about some of the legal impediments we face in obtaining funds from bad actors in situations where a fraud is well concealed, such as a Ponzi scheme. I very much appreciate the bipartisan work in Congress to address these challenges and welcome the opportunity to continue working with you to ensure that defrauded investors can get their money back. Finally, I note that we have substantially increased our efforts to engage directly with investors, entrepreneurs, and an array of market participants. In particular, we have allocated additional resources to our retail investors and entrepreneurs that live between the coasts. I believe this type of broad, direct engagement is important. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Chairman Clayton, as I highlighted in my opening remarks, the SEC has taken a number of critical steps to modernize the guidance and rules surrounding proxy advice, the proxy process, and shareholder proposals. This committee has held multiple hearings, and the SEC has conducted roundtables on these issues. These rules have not been reviewed by the Commission in decades, and I commend the SEC for taking these thoughtful actions on the staff's expertise, based on the staff's expertise to address changes in the markets that have occurred. In your public remarks, you've mentioned that you expect the Commission will address proxy plumbing and universal proxy. When can we expect to see actions to modernize these aspects of the proxy process?
Chairman Crapo, we've taken an approach to our regulatory flexibility agenda, which is if it's on the near-term agenda, we intend to get it done within the year. Those items are on the agenda. Staff is working on them, and I would hope that we would be able to move them forward in the coming year.
Well, thank you. And again, I appreciate the attention you have given it and encourage your strong focus on it to bring it to completion. Moving to a different issue, this year Facebook announced its plan to develop a new cryptocurrency called Libra. While the SEC is one of a number of regulators who would have jurisdiction over Libra, can you speak to how the Libra announcement has affected how the SEC and other regulators are working to be responsive to and innovative to market developments and trends like cryptocurrencies?
Sure. And I appreciate the question, and the question highlights what happened with that announcement. And whether it's, I'm not going to speak about the particular product, it's not appropriate for me to do so, but the announcement was a focal point for regulators of different types to recognize that digitization and the digitization of the plumbing and other aspects of our financial system, including payment transfers, et cetera, it is coming. What I'll say, just the natural economic forces that it unleashes, taking fat out of the system, for lack of a better term, it's happening. Now, we have to recognize that that's happening, recognize our mission, safety and soundness, investor protection, fair markets, and ensure that as that digitization takes place, we're being true to those principles. But we should not be fighting that digitization, because if we fight it, it will go around us.
Well, thank you. That mirrors my feelings on it, and I assume that when you say it is coming...
I'm sorry, Senator, it's here.
This year.
It's here. It is here already.
Yeah, I see. It's here. Yeah, it is here. And as I have said many times, again, leaving aside the specific proposal of Libra, the issue is one which the United States and its allies and friends in the world community need to lead on and to set the rules of the road on, rather than to let it come and develop on its own through other jurisdictions who are not as friendly to the United States, and frankly, through other currencies than the U.S. dollar. And so I encourage you and the other regulators to focus on this carefully. One of the first decisions that the United States has to make is who among our regulators are those who regulate, and how will we regulate, as well as what will be the specifics of how we set the rules of the road. So I encourage you to pay very close and careful attention to this. Finally, the SEC concept release seeking public comment on ways to harmonize the private securities offering exemption is a positive step and includes many key reforms. What are the next steps and timeline for the SEC to act?
Well, the next steps that are on our agenda, a proposal around the accredited investor definition. In your opening remarks, you highlighted one of the issues with the accredited investor definition, which is it's a binary definition based on wealth. But I'll say it simply. There are a number of people who have the sophisticated ability to assess investments who may not meet those wealth thresholds, and we should do a better job of identifying them. That said, the private markets have risks that are significant compared to the public markets, and we need to be cognizant of that.
Thank you. Senator Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Clayton. For a dozen years, Wells Fargo's management recommended voting against shareholder proposals, asking the company to separate the role of chairman and CEO, a corporate governance best practice. The amendments you've proposed to limit shareholders' ability to resubmit sensible proposals like this would have cut off Wells Fargo investors after 4 years of doing that, even though in subsequent years it received support from 37% of shareholders. And we know separating the chairman and CEO is a sensible proposal because after Wells Fargo found itself mired in scandal in abusing its employees, it decided to separate the positions and took a victory lap on it. How do you justify a proposal like you made that could limit shareholders from continuing to push for sensible governance reforms?
Senator Brown, the question that you're asking is, after a shareholder proposal has been put on the proxy and sent to all shareholders to vote on and garnered less than majority support, substantially less than, how long does it stay on the proxy? Right now, the thresholds are, effectively, if you get more than 10% of the vote, you can keep it on the proxy indefinitely. That rule has not been changed since the late 50s, early 60s, combination of rules, at a time when communications and shareholder engagement were very different. Our proposal looks at increasing those thresholds. We've back-tested them. But still, if you were able to garner more than 1 in 4 shareholders in favor of your proposal, the proposal would be able to stay on the proxy.
Well, you say that sounds good, but Commissioner Jackson's office studied data for a decade and a half, from 2004 to 2018. He found the proposed rules would have excluded 35% of the proposals for an independent board chair, 50% of board diversity proposals, and 40% of political spending disclosure proposals. These are all areas where corporations need to be doing better. Shareholders deserve it. I hope you will consider that as you think this through, where we ought to go. Let me talk for a moment about whistleblowers. You recently tried to clarify your proposal to amend the whistleblower program in saying it would not create a cap on awards. Can you commit that the final rule will be consistent with statutory requirements and not create a cap?
Absolutely, and any characterization of our proposal as a cap is completely misguided, completely misreads what our rules are. The statutory mandate is for the commission to decide between 10 and 30% of the award amount how much the whistleblower should be entitled to. I can tell you that what our proposal was intended to do was to make it clear how we make those decisions, particularly at the top end and bottom end of the spectrum. I believe in transparency in how those decisions are made. And I believe that Congress gave the commission the discretion between those bands to make those decisions. And I want to say personally, I'm not speaking for the rest of the members of the commission, I think the program has been extremely beneficial to investors, and I support it.
Well, again, you say that you support it. I believe you that you do, but I've also seen that the proposal you made has had a chilling effect. We've seen the numbers change in the last year.
When people mischaracterize things and they have a chilling effect, I just have to step in and clarify them, which is what I did.
Well, so I guess you're arguing then that the chilling effect is gone because you clarified it.
I hope so.
And
we had, you cited the $5,000 number, $5,000 whistleblower tip number, which was slightly down from last year after a long upturn, but still our tips, complaints, and referrals, which is people identifying issues for us. We had over 17,000 of those, and I think we investigate them. We try to target investigating them, or at least initially within the first week that they're received. Let me just be clear, anybody who sees a problem, let us know.
Let me just close, Mr. Chairman, with a comment from Senator Grassley. He wrote a letter to the commission. He said, in establishing the whistleblower award program, Congress was not concerned about a reward figure being too big. If anything, the legislative history shows that Congress was more concerned about potential whistleblower awards being too stingy. So let me do one more. Well, go ahead. I yield back.
Thank you.
Senator Cotton.
Mr. Clayton, I want to talk today about the collapse of WeWork. That company just laid off 2,400 workers right at Christmas, 20% of its workforce, due almost entirely to the incompetence, greed, and possible frauds and crimes of WeWork's founder, Adam Neumann. Bloomberg reported in September that the SEC was investigating WeWork and Mr. Neumann for fraud and other securities violations. Is the SEC investigating Mr. Neumann?
We do not comment on whether we are investigating or not investigating.
Okay, I thought that might be your answer, so let me put it a different way. Hypothetically speaking, if a real estate company was going public and the CEO's wife and nephew had been given positions named Chief Brand and Impact Officer and Head of Wellness, which kind of sound like phony, made-up jobs to me, might that be something that the SEC's Enforcement Division would look into?
Let me.
Hypothetically speaking.
I'm going to take a step back and say that transactions between the principals of companies, family members, other interests, are something where transparency is essential.
If the CEO of that same company sat on the compensation committee, in effect allowing him to determine his own salary, would that be considered something the SEC might want to look into?
We are very interested in the types of issues you're identifying should be transparent to investors in all of our public companies.
If the CEO had trademarked a common word like "we" and then sold it to his company for $6 million, something that would need to be disclosed and might be of concern to the SEC?
Those types of transactions are required to be disclosed.
And one final hypothetical, if the CEO of that company had credibly been accused of transporting illegal drugs in a private jet across international boundaries and spending millions of dollars of his company's money on lavish parties with famous DJs and Don Julio tequila, would that be responsible governance?
Let me say this. Our disclosure requirements around the background and character and activities of directors and officers of public companies require disclosure that would enable people to make those types of judgments.
So let me say this about the SEC's attorneys. I want to commend you for your work in the WeWork initial public offering. They filed their prospectus almost 9 months with you for review before it went public, and your lawyers caught many discrepancies in it. Like, for instance, that they claimed that they could assume a 100% occupancy rate of all their buildings, or some financial metric known as contribution margin or community adjusted EBITDA, whatever that means. So it's good that the SEC caught this. It's unfortunate they caught it at the last minute. We need a system that can catch this kind of fraud earlier before so many workers are injured. All those things, though, are things that Adam Newman either did as a matter of record or is credibly accused to have done. And at least one of them, transporting illegal drugs across international boundaries, I hope is currently under investigation by the Department of Justice for crimes. And I hope that the Enforcement Division at the SEC is investigating Adam Newman. Because today, despite all that, he is a billionaire. He received a $1.7 billion payday to walk away from the smoking rubble of his company. Or as he preferred to call it, not a company, a state of consciousness. He was able to extract that payout because the corporate governance structure gave him 10 votes per share, a kind of super voting stock that enabled him to hold his company hostage until the other investors paid him just to go away and stop destroying its value. And he's even on a 4-year consulting contract at $185 million in case they need tips on DJs or other kinds of tequila. $1 billion is a lot of money for any executive, but certainly it's a scandal for someone who presided over the ruin of his company. Leadership requires strong character and accountability, and that includes corporate leadership. That's what was absent in this case with Adam Newman and what he did to the workers at his company. Aided and abetted, I would say, by some of Wall Street's biggest banks and biggest law firms. A lot of us often lament polls that show younger Americans have doubts about capitalism and are open to socialism. For good reason, given the brutality and poverty that socialism inflicts on its people. But people like Adam Newman and what he did to WeWork is the reason people in America are open to socialism.
Senator Reid.
I'm tempted to ask you to respond to Senator Cotton's question. Mr. Chairman, as several of my colleagues have indicated, you've proposed 2 major rules, one with respect to proxy advisory firms and the other related to shareholder proposals. These are rather complicated rules, and I presume you're going to receive significant numbers of letters of comment that have to be clearly analyzed. And rather than expedition, I would urge deliberation, very careful deliberation. I think Senator Brown's comments have reflected some of the potential pitfalls in adopting these rules. I think also, too, just looking, and the Council of Institutional Investors have conducted a study that since 2016, the median number of days that a SEC rule has been promulgated and adopted is 416 days. That's more than a year. And those are for some that were rather innocuous rules. So what I would ask is that you would commit to be very deliberate, very careful, particularly analyzing the comments that are coming in, and do that in a way, excuse me, it's 413 days, I want to be correct, very, very careful in the review of these rules. The consequences will be significant. Can we get that commitment?
Yes, and the entity you mentioned, I believe I have on my calendar for tomorrow. We are open to engagement on this. I want to hear from people of all types.
Very good. Let me turn now to the issue of the status, both legal, institutional, and cultural, of some of the big accounting firms. Earlier this year, the SEC assessed a $50 million penalty to a major accounting firm for, in the words of the SEC, altering past audit work after receiving stolen information about inspections of the firm that would be conducted by the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. The SEC's audit finds that numerous audit professionals at that firm cheated on internal training exams by improperly sharing answers and manipulating test results. In addition to the finding against the firm, a principal in the firm, the second-ranking individual, was convicted of wire fraud and other crimes. These disciplinary proceedings suggest that there may be problems, as I said, both legal, institutional, and cultural within the accounting industry, particularly the big accounting industry. On top of that, Financial Times last month did a very lengthy article about the behavior in these firms, which I think you're probably aware of. You've read it, I presume, in which whistleblowers, the term arises again, came forward with experiences of harassment, bullying, discrimination. It was a very toxic article and very unflattering to all of the industry. So first, do you see these issues as significant? And second, and I hope you do, what 2 or 3 specific actions do you anticipate taking this year with respect to the issues?
So yes, Senator Reed, I do consider them very significant. High-quality financial reporting that people can rely on is the bedrock of our capital market system. And audit quality, that people can count on audit quality, is essential to that. With our Office of Chief Accountant, we are engaged on a regular basis with these firms on efforts to improve audit quality and through the PCAOB. And I want to highlight, you mentioned the Financial Times article. It's not just a domestic issue, it's an international issue. We have asked our chief accountant to take on an additional role as head of the monitoring group, which is trying to ensure high-quality audit standards across the globe. U.S. investors should understand that audit quality is not uniform. And in fact, I don't believe that it is as high quality in many places outside the United States as it is here. The only thing to do there is to try and lift it, and we're trying to do that. So I can tell you that we're engaged on a number of fronts on improving audit quality.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Reed. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk to you about the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. I think the acronym is PCAOB.
Yes.
What's that board do?
Well, they oversee the PCAOB that really has 3 functions: standard setting, inspections, and enforcement.
Basically, they review the audits of public companies. Is that right?
Yes, and broker dealers, but
right.
Essentially public companies.
To make sure that the audits are accurate and fair and honest. We have about 156 companies from our friends in China on U.S. exchanges, as I appreciate it. Big market cap, about $1.2 trillion. How many of those companies, if you know, are owned by the Chinese government?
Trying to come up with a precise number to that question would be a fool's errand.
Sure.
But I'll say I am certain that the Chinese government has a significant interest in many of those companies.
Yeah.
Direct or indirect.
the state-owned companies are under President Xi Jinping are becoming more and more prominent than privately owned companies. How many of those Chinese companies are complying with the work of, how many of the audits of those Chinese companies are working with the PCAOB to let the PCAOB review their audits?
The PCAOB requests work papers from the companies that it audits, and with respect to those companies, access to those work papers has generally not been available.
Right. So basically, our friends in China are listing companies on American exchanges. They have companies audit their companies, but our PCAOB is not able to review the audits because the companies say no. Is that right?
That's correct, and it's a problem.
What are we doing about it?
Well, we are trying to remedy that directly. Recently, because remedying that directly has taken, in my view, too long, the chairman of the PCAOB and I sat down with the heads of our big four audit firms who are generally involved through affiliates in those audits to ask what they're doing to ensure and give us comfort that the audit work they're doing is of the same quality as the audit work in other jurisdictions.
Has that helped?
I don't know yet. But that's not a one-time dialogue.
Right.
I expect to engage with them again. And I wanted to make sure that they understood how important this is, so engaging at the level of my office and the head of the PCAOB.
Well, I mean, we want to encourage companies from all over the world, including but not limited to China, to raise capital in the United States because our markets are very efficient. But there's a reason that God made the SEC and the PCAOB, and that is to make sure that these companies, these foreign companies, when they're audited, use auditing companies that are telling American people and other investors the truth. And the Chinese companies don't seem to be cooperating, and it doesn't seem to be getting better. So a lot of investors, including but not limited to American investors, are basically flying blind. And of course, we've had trouble in the past with auditing companies that don't really do a proper audit. I've got a bill that I'd like you to take a look at called the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. It basically says that a company has 3 years to cooperate with our PCAOB. And after 3 years, if they don't allow us to review the audits and answer our questions, that they're delisted. You think that would be effective?
So there is one issue, and I will look at it. Just because a company is delisted doesn't mean U.S. investors will not continue to invest in it.
That's true, but let me put it another way. It will get the attention of the foreign companies, will it not?
It will, and it will get the attention of investors, and I think both of those things are valuable.
And they'll all, not all of them, but many of them will be born again and start complying. Isn't that correct?
I hope so.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Clayton, I'm increasingly concerned about the ability of foreign actors to manipulate U.S. companies through their investments, particularly in the media and technology sectors. In 2017, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission highlighted this issue when it recommended that Congress modify FCC regulations to require greater transparency regarding Chinese government ownership of media outlets and the clear labeling of media content sponsored by the Chinese government. And I authored a provision in the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act to make sure CFIUS is requiring foreign state-owned companies to disclose their attempts to purchase U.S. companies. But the SEC also has a role to play. Section 13D of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 requires investors who become the beneficial owners of more than 5% of an issuer's equity securities to report certain identifying information to the SEC. But if undisclosed or disclosed without sufficient information, such ownership stakes could undermine the free flow of information to the American people. So my question is, how does the SEC monitor equity markets to ensure that foreign investors are not accumulating significant shares in public companies, especially in the media and technology sectors, without filing the requisite disclosures?
Senator Menendez, your question is a really good one.
It's the only ones I ever ask here. I'm just kidding.
No.
Got to have fun here.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah. No, it's
occasionally got to have fun. So.
Look, no, absolutely. Control over a public company is something our markets and investors need to know about. The 13 DG rules that essentially trigger over 5%, not just for an individual holder, but concerted efforts by others, I think are extremely important to our investors. We do try to monitor and look for violations of those rules. But I want you to know, and I'm not going to get into too much detail, our ability to track who from the U.S. is U.S. citizens who are owning companies, and it's very robust. Sometimes when investments occur through overseas accounts, it's not as robust.
And that's what I'm concerned about, so I appreciate your acknowledgement of that. Would it be fair to say that you really don't have the ability to independently verify the information in a 13D filing, or more importantly, to verify whether a foreign entity should have filed a 13D filing but failed to comply with the law?
I'm not going to go so far as to say we don't have the ability. I'm looking for ways to enhance our ability.
And so let me ask you about that. Given the need for the American public to know if their media is being funded by foreign investors, would you agree that the SEC should monitor how wrongdoing is concentrated by sector?
I'm not sure I followed you.
So by looking where you find wrongdoing, wouldn't it be of value to know which sectors those violations are taking place?
Oh, sure. People in our enforcement division, they're very good at noticing sector-specific or
let me ask you this. When you do find a suspected 13D violation, how does the SEC enforce it, and what penalties are assessed against persons or entities found to have broken the law?
I can think of some episodic ones off the top of my head, but to give you a general answer right now is difficult. I can get back to you on that, but we've seen violations in different contexts. In the takeover context, it's different from others.
So let me give you an example. There is, I'm aware from public filings of a large radio station network in the country that ultimately found that, in fact, foreign ownership, because of litigation, they didn't know who these creditors were, but ultimately through litigation found that foreign ownership exceeded the cap. They brought that to the attention of the FCC under their due diligence. Then there should have been a 13D filing by this entity, but there was not. And so the question is, in circumstances like that, now here you have a foreign entity, a group of creditors abroad, who are now owning in excess of the percentage permitted under the FCC, who didn't make a 13D filing, which is the only way a company would know whether or not they have that foreign ownership existing in their publicly traded stocks. And so then the question is, what happens to that entity? If we're to have teeth at the end of the day to this 13D and to try to protect ourselves against foreign ownership that exceeds the applicable allowable entity under the law, we need to have some teeth in the 13D process. And I really hope that as chair you'll look at that, because it comes to the essence of information that we are all making decisions on based on public information of our medias. But when it's controlled by a foreign entity, you have to wonder whether or not it's just an investment or whether it's an attempt to ultimately make influences.
Understood.
Thank you.
Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Clayton, thank you for being here. I think you and your team are doing a great job. I did want to touch on something you and I have had a discussion a couple of times over, and that's some of the proxy advisor firm rules. I know that you all have put out amendments, I think, on November the 5th, and I appreciate that you all are taking this seriously, moving forward with guidance and now these potential amendments. I'm particularly just interested in making sure that the proposed rules give impacted companies an opportunity to consult with proxy advisors and address any potential errors or conflicts of interest. But as you're looking forward, how do you think the proposed rule actually can help ensure that the proxy firms continue to play an important role in the marketplace, but also balance that against some of the issues that you and I have talked about in terms of errors and conflicts of interest?
Look, let me be clear on this. Proxy advisory firms, service firms like this, they do play an important role. Data, it's very efficient to crunch the data on a collective basis and provide that information. They can provide other services. What the proposals are looking at is really three things. One is to make it clear that the solicitation anti-fraud rules apply. You know, if you're materially misleading statements or something, I think we should address. Conflict disclosure. If you have conflicts to the extent that they would be material to the investor, you should disclose them. And then the last one is one that you, and frankly a more tricky one, is trying to improve the accuracy and completeness of the information investors from all areas have on which to make a decision. I think all of those can be accomplished in our framework. We do it in many other areas, ensuring that we have transparency around conflicts, ensuring that the anti-fraud rules apply to people who have significant influence in our marketplace, and trying to improve accuracy. That's what we're striving for, and we welcome comments.
Thank you. Are you looking beyond the rules that you all proposed on November the 5th? Are you looking at other areas of rulemaking moving forward, automatic voting, any other priorities?
Senator, I can't say that beyond that any specifics in the area of voting other than what I mentioned, which is the plumbing, trying to improve. Our plumbing is fairly archaic in the proxy area, and also universal proxy. I think that there's been enough debate about that where we can now move forward with a proposal.
Just one other thing, because I have heard some concerns over litigation and how it may increase in this space. And have you looked at this? Do you have any things that you would be looking at the SEC?
Happy to hear from people who have a concern about an increase in litigation. To be clear, the proposal makes it clear that there's no new right of action or private right of action created by the proposal. Another
area I want to touch, because I know in here we've had some of our members, and I think some of the folks on the commission have expressed some concern about buybacks and potentially stock buybacks and potentially placing limits on that. I, for one, think that it's a business trying to figure out the best way to deploy its capital. Would any kind of restrictions or additional restrictions on buybacks, what would the consequences be to mom and pop shops or I should say mom and pop investors and over time, if we limit that optimization or deployment of capital, what could it possibly have? What negative impact could it have on the average investor?
It's difficult to say with any degree of precision, but I agree with the premise of your question, which is capital allocation decisions, whether to buy a company, whether to invest in a new line, whether to pay a dividend, or whether to buy back stock. Those are board of director decisions, understanding the idiosyncrasies of the company and what they believe is best for the long-term interest of the company. To put a point on it, I'm not qualified to make that decision for them.
I agree. Thank you. Not that you wouldn't be in the boardroom, but in your current capacity, I don't think it's the inappropriate role in your current capacity. Thank you very much.
Senator Smith.
Thank you, Chair Crapo, and hello again. Nice to see you again, Mr. Clayton. So I would like to follow up on the line of questioning that Senator Brown and Senator Reed started around these shareholder proposal rules. And so last month, as you know, the SEC voted on party lines to adopt these two rules that I think will make it harder for investors to seek votes on shareholder proposals. And so I'm concerned about this, and I wanted to ask you about something specific to this. In your statement, when the commission approved these restrictions, you cited several public comment letters, and you said something to the effect of how these letters struck you the most because they came from long-term Main Street investors, including an Army veteran and a Marine veteran, a police officer, a retired teacher, and a public servant, and a mom. And this is all great, except, of course, it turns out that there's some question about the validity of these comments. And according to Bloomberg News, several of the letters that you cited weren't actually Main Street investors at all, and they did their investigation, which found out that the retired teacher said she never wrote the letter. And the military vets, it turned out that they were the brother and the cousin of the chairman of this Virginia advocacy group that was paid for by the corporate supporters of this SEC initiative. And Bloomberg went on to say that one of the retirees said that he didn't write the letter bearing his name, and the public servant cited said that she had just allowed a public affairs firm to use her name without even knowing what it was about. So I wanted to just ask you a little bit about this. Given that you cited these letters, does this have any effect on your thinking about whether this is a good idea?
Well, a couple of things. One is we're having an investigation done of this issue, so I'm just going to leave the specifics of that. I am very interested in hearing directly from individual investors, in particular directly, not filtered by groups. One of the reasons that we have conducted a large number of town halls and did so in connection with our standards of conduct rulemaking is that when you interact directly with investors, you get a lot of good information. So
I'd agree with that.
During this comment period, I encourage as many individual investors as they can to share their thoughts with us, and we will be doing town halls where they'll have the opportunity to speak directly to me.
But so you're investigating these sham letters from the public to try to understand what happened here and how they got included?
I'm not, but we were in contact as soon as the Bloomberg, I shouldn't say as soon as, but very shortly after the Bloomberg article came out, we contacted our general counsel and the Office of Inspector General.
Do you think it should be illegal to submit comments under a false identity as happened here?
You know what? I'm not going to get into that here. I think that the comment process is an open process to the extent things happen. I don't think that. Well, I'm just going to leave it at that for now.
Okay.
Let's see what happens with investigation.
Well, I'm certainly glad to know that you're investigating this. I think that that's really important. And if you're basing decisions about what to do on comments and public interactions that end up to be fueled by corporate advocacy groups, that I think is a problem.
That's why we have an open APA process and comment period.
Okay. Let me ask you another question. I also serve on the Agriculture Committee, and so this question relates to that to a certain extent. In August, the Commodities Future Trading Commission agreed to settle allegations that this food giant Kraft had manipulated the wheat market. And this settlement agreement they approved was unique because it included no factual findings or conclusions of law and prevented the commission from making any public statements about the settlement. And this is very concerning to me because I think that U.S. citizens should have the right to know what federal agencies are doing when they are settling cases. So my question to you is, how common is this practice? Is it happening at all that you're aware of at the SEC? So is this...
you're asking a very open-ended question. I'm not aware of any situation of the type that you describe. I want to make sure I carve out any kind of national security or intelligence area from what I'm saying. Not that just that's appropriate in these types of circumstances, but as far as ordinary commercial actors, I'm not aware of any. I'll have to leave it at that.
Okay, that's a great concern to me as well. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Moran.
Chairman, thank you. Thank you, Ranking Member. Mr. Chairman, thank you for joining us. I'll start by commending you for your leadership at the SEC. I appreciate the agenda you've helped accelerate over the last year. I also appreciate the openness and of your comments today, your response to questions, and the conversations we've had in office and as members of this committee. I do want to raise a concern about what I believe is occurring, an increased use of enforcement initiatives, often referred to as regulation by enforcement. At least one commissioner recently asserted that when the commission sees a widespread problem affecting investors, it should, quote, issue its own guidance or promulgate a rule and put an end to the problem before it hurts investors, under the belief, end quote, under the belief that it is both better for investors and large enforcement initiative. It is better for investors than a large enforcement initiative and provides regulated industries with appropriate notice what the SEC expects from them. Do you agree with that or have a comment as to what was being conveyed there?
So, Senator, your question highlights one of the challenges of regulating a broad market. If you see widespread conduct that's clearly problematic, there's no reason to provide guidance. You just go out and deal with it. If you see widespread conduct that is, let's put this, a new area, people, reasonably could conclude one way or the other. My view is that guidance and loud guidance is the best way to deal with that. Life is complicated. A lot of things fall somewhere in between. I think one of the things you and I have talked about is the Share Clash Initiative. I think that where we were was much closer, if not all the way at the end of the spectrum. People have different views, but I appreciate that spectrum, and I think our enforcement division and our inspections division understand that. Part of my job is to make sure they understand that and make the appropriate selection how to pursue conduct that needs to improve.
Well, Mr. Chairman, in that regard, you've said before that staff statements and guidance do not create enforceable legal obligations. Yet, I think we often see the SEC point to risk alerts and enforcement proceedings brought against other industry participants as justification for appropriate notice. I'll use the February 2018 Share Class Selection Disclosure Initiative regarding disclosures for conflicts of interest from certain fee arrangements as an example. SEC staff pointed to a 2016 risk alert as evidence that the industry was given sufficient notice about what the SEC expects from regulated firms in disclosures, such as the use of may versus will. However, I understand that the initiative has penalized firms for activity dating back to 2014 and beyond. In other words, previous to the notice that you're claiming occurred. Is there something here that I should be worried about?
I don't think there's something here in particular that you should be worried about, but I do think that the principles you articulate are something that we should always be concerned about. We should not be in the business of gotcha, but we do need to be in the business of making sure that we enforce our laws.
Well, I mean,
and if the commission feels some way about it, we, the commission, should articulate it. We shouldn't be relying on staff guidance. If there is to be a change in the law, that should come from the commission, or change in the regulation.
I fully support the initiative's objectives to provide important protections for our retail investors. That's not really the issue. I don't know exactly what due process means in today's world, but notice has always been something that is included in due process. And in order to, one, I would hope that those that you have the ability to regulate, if they knew what the position of the SEC was, they would comply voluntarily. That's a positive in and of itself. And secondly, for there to occur something in which there seemingly was no notice, denies them the ability to voluntarily comply, and it eliminates the opportunity for them to have, quote, due process.
Understood. And
thank you. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. Chairman Clayton, thank you for appearing today. Appreciate it. I want to talk to you a little bit about my concern and what can be done and what you're doing to prohibit requests or excuse me, prohibit bequests from clients. And so let me give you an example. I sent a letter along with some of my colleagues to FINRA to limit the ability of broker dealers and other financial advisors to inherit money from their clients. And big concern. I know as a former Attorney General, there's fraud oftentimes associated with that. Now, granted, I understand that some family members, there could be exceptions for certain relationships, but most importantly concerned about the fraud that is associated with it. So I guess my question to you is twofold. Do you think that regulators should prohibit financial advisors to receive bequests from their clients? And what are you doing to address that issue?
So on the specific question, I'm going to have to, on the contours of it, I'm not going to comment, but on the area of our elderly, many of whom are in a position where they may have diminished capacity or not have support, we are very concerned about that. Yeah, let me just say that the fact pattern that you posit of a trusted advisor receiving an inheritance, that's something that strikes me as, very difficult to understand how that could happen, and worries me. What specifically we're doing about it, we're doing a lot at the SEC to recognize that many of our investors are getting older, and we need to deal with that fact, including implementing the Senior Safe Act, which allows broker-dealers to hold off on distributing funds if they think that something inappropriate is going on. But I'm happy to engage with you further on this issue.
I would appreciate that, because I think it is an issue that needs to be addressed, and I look forward to seeing what you're doing to address the issue. I also appreciate your attention to preventing retail investors from falling victim to fraud. FINRA has proposed a rule to make it more difficult for dishonest brokers and their firms to operate. Again, last month, along with my colleagues, we sent a letter to FINRA asking them to strengthen its proposed Rule 4111 to expel firms and the brokers with a history of fraud. I know FINRA is finalizing this rule now. My understanding is going to be passed to the SEC for you to take a look at. I guess my question is just, will you ensure that Rule 4111 is clear that unscrupulous financial professionals cannot continue to operate? And then secondly, would be when will the SEC approve, or when do you anticipate taking a look at that rule and approving it or having a comment with respect to 4111?
Yeah. Let me say generally, our view is it's a privilege to work in our securities markets. It's a privilege that you can lose and should lose if you misbehave. I want to be careful not to prejudge. I haven't seen the text of the rule, but I will say I have long been supportive of the concepts that are in that rule, including that, let's put it this way, if you're going to hire somebody who has a history, the registration and other requirements that FINRA imposes should reflect that you're taking more risk than someone who doesn't.
Thank you. And then let me also, I appreciate the concern around digital currency. This is an area I think, along with the chairman, I'm paying very close attention to. And I know your comment, you said it's here, we should not go around it. Absolutely agree. And I'm hopeful that as we move forward, that you're putting resources to addressing and taking a look at this and what can be done, but also at the same time coming back to Congress and talking to us about what we can do working with you to really be prepared for the future of digital currency, because it is coming. I think we need to be prepared for it. So thank you. But I do have one final question with respect to the enforcement. I was glad to see that the SEC had taken action against cryptocurrency firms that failed to comply with requirements for raising funds from investors. However, according to a recent article at the Wall Street Journal, 3 of the companies missed their deadline to repay people who bought their token. What is the SEC doing about cryptocurrency companies that failed to comply with the SEC settlements? 1, and then 2, do you have enough resources within the enforcement division to address these issues?
Okay. So let me try and summarize what can happen with settlements sometime. We try to structure settlements, and I think we're really trying to structure settlements in a way that tries to get the most money back to investors over time. Sometimes that means allowing payments over time, the enterprise to continue and to try and to get the money back. And sometimes they just fail because they were not good companies to start with. I think some of that paradigm applies to the situations that you identified, or at least some of them. In terms of resources, look, I think we can do our job. When I first took this job, I didn't know what I would do with significant additional resources. Now I feel better. To the extent we can have additional resources, particularly in some of these emerging areas, we can put them to good use. But we can do our job. That's really how I feel about it.
Thank you. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you. Senator Kramer.
Thank you, Chairman Crapo, and thank you, Chairman Clayton, for being with us and for your candor. I want to drill down a little bit on the certified audit trail, the CAT issue, which is, of course, by design to collect a lot of personal, sensitive financial information. In fact, information on every retail brokerage client in our country, as I understand it, which should amount to, by my calculations, over 100 million clients. And that's, in and of itself, that much data, that much sensitive information compiled in one place is, has its challenges. But in addition to that, the SROs, as I understand it, with some 3,000 people, 24 organizations, will have the ability not only to access it, but then to be able to bulk download it into their systems. I didn't used to be paranoid, but I've come to a point where the ability for institutions to secure that much data with this, especially sort of this broad application of it, concerns me. And I'd love for you to help me feel more comfortable with what the SEC is doing to protect against attacks and cyber challenges with that kind of a risk.
Yeah, the CAT is a good example of, I think, how we should look at a lot of large data projects. I agree with your concern, and the question is, the fundamental question is not what data would we like to have, but what data do we need to do the job? And we're going through a process with the SROs and others. I think we can significantly limit. I've said, just speaking for myself, phone book information from individuals should enable us to do our job and have the CAT function in the way it was envisioned to function. So that reduces the risk because the data isn't as sensitive. And then, of course, the other side of the coin is what type of security protections do you put in place, and how do you ensure that those security protections can evolve as the threats evolve? So that's kind of a general summary, but we're working on reducing the sensitive data and ensuring that folks have insight into and we continue to improve the security protections.
Well, to just drill down a little further, then, my understanding is that the firms are required to sign this CAT reporter agreement, which in essence shields the SROs from liability. And anytime we start shielding institutions or individuals from liability, I always ask, well, why? Why is that necessary? I mean, if the safeguards are in place, it only adds to my insecurity, if you will, Mr. Chairman. So I'm just, from my point of view, this is highly risky, and I believe a breach will eventually happen. But I hope that the SEC can prevent that, obviously.
I'm aware of the issue around the allocation of potential liability, and I'm actually meeting tomorrow with representatives of the SRO community and what I'll call the dealer community to discuss the issue.
Sure. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Busy day tomorrow.
It sounds like it.
Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Clayton, thank you for being here. I want to ask you about the Commission's engagement on the work of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. How are you working with the task force?
So we're working, Let me try and level that. There are international bodies. There's FSB, IOSCO, and I'll put the EU there. We're working with all of them on this issue because market disclosure issues of this type are global issues. They're not just domestic issues. And we're I would say, on medium, light, heavy, we're fairly heavily engaged on this as compared to some other issues.
And specifically, what are you doing with them?
Well, me specifically?
I mean, the commission.
Yeah. Working on the reports, working on proposals. But, it's not just that. I think it goes beyond that. I personally have recently met with Vladis Dombrovskis from the EU, spoken with Mark Carney, working through Randy Quarles, trying to bring some, what I would say is, I'm going to use Mark's words. I think it's very good. Decision useful information to the marketplace in this regard. I think that's a good way to look at it.
And you think that we're not quite there yet?
It's hard. I think we're not quite yet. Yeah, I think it's hard.
Are you actively enforcing your 2010 guidance on climate disclosure?
If what you mean by actively enforcing it is, are we actively monitoring companies to see if they're following it? And to the extent they're not addressing that, I think the answer is a clear yes. You can.
I think one way you could more actively enforce it would be to put issuers on notice that this is something that Division of Corporation Finance will be examining.
Oh, let me say that. We examine for this when we examine filings.
Thank you. I think people listen more carefully if you say we examine for this.
To be clear, we examine for this, and have been examining for it. And I would encourage people to look at the comment letters that eventually become available publicly.
And I divide this problem into a number of categories. The first was sort of politics, and I think we're mostly in terms of your commission, we're mostly through that part of the problem. But there are a couple of other problems. One is that we have to develop instruments and processes that kind of work across platforms and across the planet, so that when you're doing disclosures, you're comparing apples to apples. But the other part of this is whether or not you as an agency are leading versus sort of waiting for TCFD and others, and seeing how things play out. So in the kind of in the ecosystem that's working on this, would you consider the SEC a leader or a follower or a participant? Where do you put yourself in this?
Definitely a participant, and I would say a leader through that decision useful lens, including trying to articulate ways that we can use the information that is being generated to further our, what I would say is monitoring oversight. There are a bunch of voluntary disclosure regimes, as you know, TCFD and the Carbon Disclosure Project, and some organizations that come under your jurisdiction are making voluntary disclosures under TCFD and others, and then they make a separate sort of less informative disclosure as it relates to climate risk to you. Do you consider it appropriate for the commission to then look at those voluntary disclosures and incorporate into your risk analysis? Back to your thing of, do we examine for this? Not just in this area, but in many areas. We look at a company's public disclosure, the required statutory disclosure in their annual report or 10K or whatnot, and compare it to what they're saying other places, and often ask companies, please make sure that reconcile these for us to the extent they don't look consistent, and tell us why there are any inconsistencies. That is something that we do.
And you think you can be useful in terms of being decision useful? There are a number of ways to look at that, but one of the problems is you've just got different ways to disclose climate-related risk. Do you think the SEC can lead or at least assist in developing a more consistent, comparable, thorough disclosure for climate risks?
Let me say this. I think we have a great deal of expertise in assisting registrants in disclosing risks in a way that investors can use it. And we're trying to bring that to bear in all areas of what we do, including this.
Thank you.
Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, good morning. I want to follow up a little bit on the issue of the consolidated audit trail. It seems to me that you've suggested that there will be modifications, or at least we could expect modifications, based upon the amount of data that might be collected. I am concerned because clearly there is a very high probability that there would be breaches. Just as an example, having an employee to take home a notepad with data on it. Any type of a process in which employees can gain access and then simply lose it, if nothing else. These all seem to be ways in which data could be lost. We're talking about the consolidation of data from a lot of different entities into one location, which seems to be making for a prime opportunity for nefarious activities. My question is, number one, when we start talking about the limitation of liability, as Senator Kramer has suggested, it bears to mind that somebody still has that loss. And the question then is do you believe that the rules as they're currently being laid out, or at least the guidelines as we're currently seeing them, where there are limitations for some, are these fair, the way that they're set up to limit the liability? And are you going to go so far as to maybe review that process of the limitations that are currently being put in place today?
Yeah. The short answer is yes. Do you want the longer answer?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. The longer answer is your premise is right in that when you allocate responsibility, you generally try to allocate it to the people who can best address the risk or are responsible for it. And, that's something that's in my mind as I look at these things.
Okay, well, I think this, I just want to bring attention, I really do think this is a serious issue, and it doesn't mean that you don't need a consolidated audit trail, but if you're going to go that route, then it's got to be something in which data has to be kept in some kind of a secure entity. And if you can't do that, and I'm not sure that you can, then perhaps we should be looking at a more limited amount of data, and it sounds to me like you're looking at that, but then along that line, making certain that where the possibility of risk is at, the blame does not leave that location. So there is a responsibility and an authority which are combined for the protection of that risk.
Understood.
Okay.
Understood.
Second, let me just, I want to go back in a little bit. I've listened with interest, and I want to just give you an opportunity, should I say, to perhaps clarify the suggestion that Libra might be ridiculous. And I want to go into this with the following. I know that there's been a number of folks that have wondered whether or not Libra, which I think was an attempt to do something different, if we simply walk away from that thing and simply say that is ridiculous or the product is ridiculous, which is the way that I heard it, I think we pick winners and losers.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's
let me jump in and be clear. I'm not passing judgment on any. If my comments were say that Libra, that any product is ridiculous or not ridiculous, I can tell you what, I don't know. What I do know is there is a great deal of, how do I say it, friction in the marketplace that digitization can reduce. We need to make sure that to the extent that happens, we're still being true to our statutory missions across the federal financial regulatory community. And ours, investor protection, efficient markets, at the banking, I don't want to speak for them, but safety and soundness, et cetera. Can't lose sight of those things because of a new technology, but we also can't rely on old technology to ensure that we do those things.
That's right. And you're looking at definitions right now that come from a 90-year-old law. And I guess, let me just maybe cut to the chase on it. Do you delineate, do you see a difference between, and do you see it as a separation between a cryptocurrency and perhaps a digital currency? One, do you see this as being the separating issue where you literally have a digital currency today in some respects backed by a sovereign versus a crypto which may not be backed that way? Is that what you have an obligation, I guess, in this case as a regulator to where you may be looking at both?
let me say this. I think there's a lot going on there. It's complicated. We already have a great deal of digitization in our financial system. I do believe there is a difference between a sovereign-backed medium of exchange and a private medium of exchange.
I agree with you, and I think I just want to make sure you've got the tools necessary to look at both if that's your charge.
Yeah, I want to say to you and this committee, I've heard you, and I appreciate that to the extent we need something, we should be engaged with you, and I thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Chairman. A couple things. First, I want to associate myself with Senator Kennedy's remarks about our legislation to require that Chinese companies listed on our exchanges meet the same audit requirements we require of everybody else. Seems to be common sense. Second, on a number of occasions when we've had hearings, I've raised with you the issue of the strong correlation between the timing of insider share selling and stock buybacks. Since we last discussed that, Commissioner Jackson and others have presented even more evidence that the timing is not a coincidence, that executives may be manipulating the timing to fatten their returns at the expense of their shareholders. And I'm disappointed that you and the Commission have not moved forward more rapidly to investigate this. And I'm disappointed that instead you are focused on strengthening the hand of already very strong CEOs and corporations at the expense of their shareholders in many cases with the proxy advisory regulation you've proposed. And this seems to be an answer in search of the problem. There are some issues. We all know what you describe as sort of the plumbing and trying to figure it out. I also agree with the conflict of interest provisions. But what you're doing is saying that if I go out and hire somebody, an independent proxy advisor, to make recommendations to me about how I should vote with my shares, that proxy advisor then has to go to the company and the CEOs and get them to essentially comment on them, and they get to have a number of reviews. You know, I really don't need a nanny to advise me. If I don't want to hire a proxy advisor, I don't have to. But what troubled me even more was you did try to present this as sort of a concern of Main Street investors. When you rolled this out, you attempted to create the impression that this was something a lot of Main Street investors care about. And I can tell you, I sit on the committee, I've served in the House, I've been in the Senate. I've not had a Main Street investor ever come up to me and say, this is a concern of theirs. Now, if there are, I look forward to it. But you got duped when you rolled out that statement. Senator Smith asked you about that. But the reality is, in addition to the fake letters that she mentioned, people who, a teacher who you cited, who apparently says now she didn't write the letter, there were a number of letters you cited that were clearly orchestrated by a group called 60 Plus. Now, for those of us who've been around here for a little while, we know what 60 Plus is. It's a dark money front group that corporations use for messaging. They don't have to disclose their donors. It sounds great. They make it sound like they're taking care of seniors. But we have found out some of their donors include corporations like Chevron and Exxon. And so it turns out that a number of the letters you cited were from relatives of the head of 60 Plus. Are you aware of that now?
I've now heard this. I was not familiar with the group 60 Plus.
Okay. So were you aware that the retired couple you cited are the mother and father-in-law of the head of the 60 Plus Association? Are you aware of that now?
Only because you just told me.
Are you aware they told the reporter they had no connection themselves with the letter? No. Are you aware that the military veterans that you cited are the brother and cousin of the chairman of the 60 Plus Association? Mr. Chairman, look, if a company had done this, we could go after them for deceptive practices, for misleading statements. I know you didn't intend to do that, but you became the vehicle for that. And you became the vehicle for that as you tried to roll out this provision with the patina that it was looking out for Main Street investors. Wasn't that your intent?
regardless of this colloquy, I still believe we're looking out for Main Street investors.
It doesn't appear to me to do that. This is the top priority. This in and of itself doesn't make it bad, but it does mean you should be cautious before you say it's the top priority of Main Street investors. This is the top priority of a lot of corporate CEOs who don't want to be second-guessed by proxy advisors. Isn't that true?
So look, let's see what we agree on. Disclosure conflicts.
Yeah. So I said in my remarks, that's fine. That's number one. Yeah. There's 2 and 3 where you require everybody.
No. Okay. We'll get to 3. But disclosure conflicts. Take commensurate responsibility for what you're saying. The anti-fraud rules should apply. Okay. The last one, I will tell you, I'm open for discussion on all of them. The last one on how we ensure better accuracy, I'm very open. If people think that what we're proposing is too onerous, but we can get to improved accuracy in another way, I'm open.
As you know, there's an ongoing lawsuit right now on this issue because the basis for your rulemaking is that the proxy solicitation, that the proxy advice is the same as a proxy solicitation.
Well, it depends on how you.
That's how you. My understanding that was a 3-2 vote. So
there are different levels, but
so there's an ongoing lawsuit, and that goes to the heart of the question of your authority. So my question is, are you willing to delay the rulemaking process pending the outcome of this lawsuit?
I'm not going to commit to that today.
Okay. Well, what if you go through this process and then the lawsuit says there was no authority to do it?
Unfortunately, that is a risk that we run.
Okay.
The advice we've gotten is that we should be very comfortable with where we are.
So, just in closing, Mr. Chairman, my biggest concern right now is the way you tried to present this when you rolled it out, and you did get duped.
I am not backing away from the fact that we want to do what's in the best interest of our long-term.
That's a great goal, but Mr. Chairman, the letters you cited were orchestrated by a dark money group that is funded by many of the corporations that stand to benefit from your proposal. They're advocating for that. They're using this group to funnel their money through, and you became their mouthpiece. So I do think it's important for you to retract those statements, to let the public know that you were duped. I mean, you didn't intentionally deceive anybody, but the letters that you used to make the case that this was for Main Street investors were in fact orchestrated by a group that is funded by some of the very big corporations that are pushing hard for the rule. And that's a deceit on the public, not from you, but you became the vehicle for that. And I hope you will make it very clear that you find that outrageous, that the people who hope that you're going to do this, these are people who are pushing hard for this to happen. Yeah. And you became the vehicle for their fraudulent attempts to make it sound like this was all about Main Street investors. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And Senator Brown would like to ask another question.
Yeah, first, a comment on thank Senator Van Hollen for his comments and his back and forth with the chairman. We hear always in this committee, particularly from that side of the aisle, about mom and pop investors, and all the Trump nominees want to take care of the little guy and the mom and pop investors. And I think Senator Van Hollen's investigation and comments show that oftentimes the mom and pop investors have some front to not be conspiratorial in this town and in these days, but that it's pretty clear that's been what's happening for years in so many of these dark money groups. Let me take a slightly different place, and just one question, Mr. Chairman. Early in my opening statement, I think my opening statement, I mentioned that I asked for inclusion of a letter from the Ohio Public Employees Retirement System, and I appreciate the Chairman graciously did that. They weighed in last year at the SEC roundtable on proxy voting issues. They raised concerns that changes to the rules would make proxy advisor advice more expensive, less independent, less timely, and could ultimately hurt public pension participants. The proposal you issued last month would do all of those things under the pretense of improving conflict disclosure and eliminating errors, but the rule would go far beyond that by giving companies 2 bites at the apple to review proxy research before it gets to investors that are paying for it. How do those sweeping changes that institutions didn't ask for and that could compromise the research they're paying for, how does that benefit investors?
Well, Senator, I do think that robust conflict disclosure, when it's material, does benefit investors. They should know what incentives people have when they're making statements. I do believe that if you're making statements in an attempt to influence or solicit votes, generally anti-fraud principles should apply. On the last one, how to increase accuracy, like I said to Senator Van Hollen, I remain open to ways to deal with that. But let's just be clear what we're trying to achieve here. We're trying to achieve that the investor has a robust mix of information on which to make an investment decision. And if that comes from a proxy advisory firm in combination with the company, so much the better.
Well, it looks to a lot, thank you for that. It looks to a lot of us that we, again, tip the power too far in favor of companies, and management needs to be more accountable, not less, and shareholders need more tools, not fewer. And the direction that you seem to be going is not that.
But let's also be clear. We're not, say on pay, other engagement mechanisms. What I want to achieve here is that people who are making the investment decision, the voting decision, have as good a mix and as accurate a mix of information as they can have. That's what I want to achieve.
Thank you. That concludes the questioning today. And again, I want to thank you, Chairman Clayton, for being here today and also for your strong leadership at the SEC. I appreciate it. For senators who wish to submit questions for the record, those questions are due on Tuesday, December 17th. And I encourage you, Chairman, to please respond as promptly as you can to them.
Okay.
This is our last hearing for this Congress, unless we schedule another one. And we've had a lot of productive hearings. I think that we I want to thank all of our senators for making that happen, and also our witnesses and those who have come before us. And it's laid the foundation for what I expect to be a significant amount of productive effort. With that, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you. Thank you.
I thought they were going to mark up next week, the infamous cannabis banking bill that keeps trying to pop up every day, or beneficial ownership. Yeah.